Alright, everybody, welcome to Eerie Hours. I'm your host, Gene Skinner. I hope you are looking forward to a night talking about the Fae, a bunch of them that you probably already know, and some Celtic mythology in general, which are shared between the Scottish, the Irish, the Welsh, and I'm pretty sure that's it. I don't think anybody else really shares the mythology. Maybe some parts of Britain, but I don't think so. Anyway, before we get into the show tonight, I'd like to give a little shout out to Spooky Movie Night. They will be doing a show at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they're doing a random. Let me see. It's two random picks for a double feature, and they are the random movie Bin of Death is what the actual thing is called. So be sure to tune in to that at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time if you would like to do that. And the beer I'm drinking tonight, as I crack it open, happens to be the Harvester, a beer I've had before in different flavors. This happens to be a sour ale with cranberries, cherry, and tangerine. It's the original Harvester, too. Let me just pour that. Pouring into a goblet-styled glass. It's not really high in ABV. Sours usually tend to not be. Looks good. Definitely taste the fruit. Cherry, cranberry, and tangerine go really well together. Nice. Alright, so the first thing we're going to watch is an overview video, I believe. And yes, Strug, I do see that too as well. This came up as just a video for Gene's stream. Yes, the mysteries of the Celtic otherworlds, myths, and monsters. That actually is like 2 hours long, so if you want a really in-depth view of Celtic stuff in one video, it's that. That'd be really good to probably watch. I have some more stuff that's just, how it will be. Anyway, let's look at our first video we have tonight. And sorry if it looks like that's loading. I don't know what's going on with fucking Firefox. It's being a little bitch. Okay, this video is called The Incredible Creatures of Celtic Mythology and Folklore. It's basically a mythology bestiary from CU in History. Let's take a watch of this. Here we go. Stop lagging.
Mythology is one of the most diverse in the world, whose stories refer to several creatures. Some are kind and peaceful,
Sometimes.
Others are hideous and cruel monsters. The leprechaun is one of the best known figures in Celtic mythology, and is well known
We
in
have a few of
Irish
these kind of
folklore.
overview videos,
Usually represented as a small man,
I'm sure
with
a lot
a
of you
size
know
between
these
30
creatures
and
anyway.
50 centimeters, the leprechaun is part
a
of the
banshee
family of
leprechaun.
elves and gnomes. He lives in the bushes, or in small burrows made in the tree trunks of the forest, where he spends his days working on a single shoe.
They always do
As the
helpful
shoemaker
thing.
in charge of making the shoes for the fairy people, the leprechaun makes only one pair of shoes a year, as
Wow.
these are magical and extremely
Magic
rare
shoes.
items. The leprechaun is also known to be the guardian of valuable treasures, such as pots full of gold coins. For this reason, he usually avoids humans, who, driven by greed,
Wants
always
gold.
try to capture the leprechaun to steal the precious metal.
Me gold.
Although they are almost always associated with
God.
forests and woods, some creatures
That
from
looks like
Celtic
some furry
mythology
banner.
also inhabit the seas. Selkies are humanoid beings that live in the sea, but differ from the traditional versions of mermaids found in other cultures.
Yeah, so they're manatees.
Selkies can assume the form of seals, and return to their human appearance whenever they wish.
Oh, okay.
To change shape, a Selkie only needs to swim to shore. When she reaches dry land, she removes her sealskin, becoming a beautiful young woman.
I'm sure.
When she returns to the sea, Selkie puts her sealskin back on and dives into the water. There are also male Selkies, described as very handsome in human form. They seek out human females who
That
are
looks like someone from
dissatisfied with their
fucking
love
Avatar.
life. If a woman wants to establish contact with a male Selkie, she must go to a beach and even shed 7 tears into the sea. The origin of Selkies is mysterious. Some people believe that they were once human beings, but, victims of some curse, they were condemned to live like animals until the end of their days. Others believe that Selkies are souls of those who have drowned and are trapped between the material and spiritual worlds. When we think of fairies, we usually imagine kind and cheerful creatures that flutter and dance among the trees and flowers. But there are also dark fairies who will do anything to harm humans. A good example of an evil fairy is the Línan Siada, also known as the fairy lover in Irish folklore. Lenin is portrayed as an exceptionally beautiful woman who lives near the tombs and cemeteries and is always looking for male lovers, especially widowers who visit the graves of their deceased wives. Legend has it that when a man becomes the lover of a Leonin, he shortens his life, but is filled with pleasures and joys. An old legend says that there was once an artist that had no inspiration to create his songs. Then a Leonin appeared before him, in exchange for his love, gave him the inspiration he needed to continue his work. The artist accepted the proposal and spent his days totally in love with the Leonin, composing the most beautiful songs ever written and making a lot of money. But as days passed, madness took over his mind and he died alone, wandering among the hills of Ireland. Another example of evil fairies are the fearsome banshees, whose cries are so loud and terrifying that they can take a person's life. Banshees live in the dark regions of forests and are often found in graveyards, where they wander among the graves, shedding tears of grief and resentment. The cry of the banshees is a harbinger of death, announcing that the end of a life is near, either the person who heard the cry or a close relative. The legend of the banshees come from an ancient Celtic custom, where some women were hired to mourn wistfully the death of some important member of the nobility. Banshees can arise both physically and spiritually. Their death scream can be heard from miles away, making it impossible to escape the clutches of death. Although they are also part of the fairy family, Spriggans have little in common with their relatives. They are perhaps the strangest creatures in Celtic mythology. Spriggans are usually male beings with a distorted and ugly body, often made of wood and tree leaves. Although they are almost always small, Spriggans are considered ghosts of giants who, even though they inhabit a more fragile body, retain their enormous ancient strength. In some stories, they can grow enormously when they are angry, briefly regaining the full magnitude of their past as giants. Spriggans live in old castle ruins, where they guard buried treasures and love to do evil against those who offer them. They are blamed for episodes of bad luck, for stolen houses, collapsed buildings, or stolen cattle, for example. As was the case in many ancient cultures, the Celts believed in the existence of sacred and cursed places, which were often inhabited by man-eating creatures. Kelpies are spirit beings, found mainly in Scottish folklore, due to their past as giants. Cultures, the Celts believed in the existence of sacred and cursed places, which were often inhabited by man-eating creatures. Kelpies are spirit beings, found mainly in Scottish folklore. They live in the lochs and dark moors. Kelpies look like large horses with dark fur and a cadaverous appearance. They can assume a beautiful human form to lure people to the water, where they are suddenly attacked and devoured by the monsters. In some cases, Kelpies take their victims into the water, devour them, and throw their entrails at the water's edge.
Sounds great.
Despite mentioning a dark and frightening creature, the legend of the Kelpies was a warning to children and young people not to go alone to the lakes, where they could have accidents and drown. With the arrival of Christianity in Scotland in the 6th century, folk beliefs were altered and the Kelpies became associated with the figure of Satan. They began to be portrayed as a hybrid between a hoofed animal and a human body, like the god Pan from Greek mythology.
I mean, kinda.
Belief in the spirit world also influenced a considerable part of life in Celtic culture. People believed that the souls of the dead will be judged by the gods, and only the worthy could enter the other world. But if a person were despicable, cruel, and dishonored in life, he could be rejected by the gods and condemned to a life as a wandering spirit known as slough. Present in Irish and Scottish folklore, the slough were the souls of evil people who, even after death, maintained confrontational and destructive behavior. Since a single spirit does not represent a great danger, the slough formed groups that moved like ghostly clouds, usually coming from the west. They would try to enter the houses of people dying to steal their souls, and then add them to their melancholy cloud. For this reason, the windows of a house that were faced west were sometimes kept closed to keep potential victims of the slough away. Another being that exists between the world of the living and the world of the dead is the cruel Abertach. a vampire who rises from his grave to drink human blood. The ancient inhabitants of Ireland were afraid to go near the cemeteries at night, as they were sure that they would be attacked by Abertak. Legend says that the Abertak had been a dangerous dwarf, connoisseur of powerful magic, and someone who loved to do mischief wherever he went. Tired of seeing his people suffer, a tribal chief, who was also a great warrior, killed the dwarf. He was buried vertically, but the next day he reappeared as a vampire, more powerful than ever. The tribal chief killed him a second time, but the dwarf came back to life again. Finally, a wise druid told the warrior to kill him a third time and bury the body upside down, ending the monster's existence.
Once and for all.
Something interesting about this legend is that there is actually a place known as the Giant's Grave in Ireland, where the locals believe Abertak is buried to this day.
Do they now?
As the Middle Ages approached, many Celtic legends were adapted and included in medieval tales. The Questing Beast is a monster that appears in the King Arthur legends, with origins in Galician Portuguese folklore, which in turn had many influences from Celtic folklore.
Of course.
The bestial creature was the fruit of a forbidden love between a princess and a demon. Therefore, its very existence was evil and harmful to the world. Similar to the griffins of Greek and Asian mythology, the Questing Beast is a hybrid of several animals, with deer feet, lion's tail, leopard's body, and snake's head. As the fruit of an evil relationship, the Questing Beast could only be killed by a knight of the Holy Grail. His end came in an epic fight against the knight Palamedes, who is part of the medieval legend of Tristan and Isolde. Some of the oldest legends of Celtic culture tell of a great war for dominance in Ireland between the divine people of the Tuatha De Danann and the demonic Fomorians, who were giant monstrous beings from the sea or the center of the earth. The greatest warrior of the Fomorians was the most powerful of his kind, known as Balor, the Evil Eye.
I
Balor
wonder
was
where
a giant.
Tolkien got his
According
stuff
to
from.
different versions of the story, he could have 1, 2, or 3 eyes, one of them poisonous and incendiary. With unequal strength and a powerful magical eye, during battles, Balor would launch a jet of fire capable of melting and setting fire to everything in its path. Seemingly invincible, Balor was killed during a great battle where he faced the great god Lugh. Lugh, with a flaming spear, pierced Balor's eye, putting an end to his reign of terror. Celtic mythology is so vast in its stories that it continues to be studied and unraveled to this day. Much of its influence can be found in current literary and cinematic works.
The Celts and the riches. Yeah. Alright, let's move on to the next video. Oh. Let's do that. Is it actually showing that? No, it's not. I'm dismissing that for now. This is this from Mythologies and Fiction Explained. This is I don't know how to fucking pronounce this. The Legend of the Irish Hulk. Basically, he's the Irish Hulk. Look at him. I'm gonna go back because it's at like 4 seconds in. Any day now. I said go back to the start. Not 4 seconds fucking in. Come on. Come on. Come on. Browser. Come on. Oh, you made it a second in. Nope. Let's do that. There we go. And can I hit play? Thank you. There's a lag. There is a lag going on.
Throughout every culture or branch of mythology, there is always at least one iconic hero, and in fact most of the time there are many more. Today we travel to Ireland to discuss Cuchulainn, an Irish hero who has been likened to the Greek hero Achilles in terms of his reckless courage, the ability to inspire fear in his enemies, and his part mortal, part immortal persona. Cuchulainn has gone by several names over the years, including Cuchulainn, Cuchulainn, and of course most commonly amongst Irish people as Cuchulainn. His name itself meant Cuchulainn's hound, the name of a blacksmith that he would eventually serve. As we've already mentioned, he was an Irish hero, but he was also the central figure of the Ulster Cycle, a series of legends and sagas that took place in medieval Ireland. Many believe that he was in fact the incarnation of his father, Lu, the warrior and saviour of the Tuatha De Danann. His mother, on the other hand, was a mortal, making him what many would consider to be a demigod.
Yeah.
His appearance is commonly described as a small young man with no beard and thick black hair. And then you have some truly peculiar and odd descriptions of him. My favourite of these being that his hair was brown at the base, blood red in the middle, with a crown of yellow surrounding it. He had 4 dimples in each cheek, yellow, green, crimson and blue, 7 bright pupils in each eye. Each foot had 7 toes and each hand had 7 fingers. His nails resembled a hawk's claw or a griffin's clench. Now, as you can see, these depictions do vary quite dramatically, and it might have been a case of his image changing over time to appear more terrifying. Cuchulainn is a figure that we can almost equate to an old Irish Incredible Hulk, as he would enter trances of superhuman rage, and once the need for violence and anger had come to an end, he would return to a much more gentle and sensitive being. These transformations became visible even from a very young age. When he first became part of a group of boys being trained at the fortress Emain Macha, he ran onto the playing field, without asking for any of the elder boys' permission or protection. Unaware of this custom, the other boys saw this as a challenge of their abilities, and they began to attack our young hero. It's here that Cuchulainn had what was known as a riastrad. This process is often described as a warp spasm, a truly disturbing transformation. His muscles would rapidly expand, his legs would twist themselves backwards, one eye would be sucked inside of his head, and the other one would fall outward, hanging from his face.
Ew.
His cheeks peeled themselves away from his mouth, revealing his jaw, and his internal organs were now visible. His hair would stand up in the shape of a spike, so strong that it could skewer an apple, and from his forehead would spurt streams of blood onto his enemies. In short, his body would turn itself inside out when driven into one of these fits of rage, and on this particular occasion, he proceeded to beat every single boy who attacked him, with only one hand. It didn't take long before the boys would ask to be placed under Cuchulainn's protection, or rather Setanta as he was known at that time. Cuchulainn was not the name that he was born with, it was a name that he was later given. The name his mother gave him was Setanta. When the King of Ulster was invited to a banquet at the house of Cuchulainn the blacksmith, he asked his nephew Setanta to accompany him. When they arrived, Setanta joined in on a hurling game with some of the other boys. The king was so impressed by his nephew that he invited him to join in on the feast. Setanta accepted his uncle's request, but only once the game had finished, and unfortunately the king forgot to tell Cuchulainn of his nephew's invitation. When he saw a stranger approaching, he unleashed his ferocious hound. This stranger was of course Setanta, and after being attacked by the hound, he had no choice but to defend himself, eventually killing the dog. The way Setanta defeated the hound, like many things in Irish mythology, was quite graphic. Still holding the hurling ball from earlier, the boy flung the ball into the hound's throat, and then proceeded to smash the hound's head against the stone courtyard. When Cuchulainn saw what had happened to his hound, he was devastated. Setanta, wishing to atone for his actions, then promised to rear the smith a new hound, but until it came of age, he himself would protect Cullen's house. The druid Cathbad then announced that the boy's name from this day would be Cuchulainn, meaning Cullen's hound. When training at Emain Macha, the druid Cathbad was asked a very particular question, as to what the significance of the current day was, to which he replied that any warrior that took arms on this day would have everlasting fame and glory. Naturally, Cuchulainn, overhearing this, went straight to his uncle and asked to take up arms despite only being 7 years old. When the druid saw the boy take arms, he began to immediately grieve, as the prophecy he had heard was not finished. Any warrior that took up arms on this day would be extremely famous, but in exchange his life would also be extremely short. Cuchulainn was given the king's chariot, and he travelled to the sons of Necten Us, who had boasted of killing more Ulstermen than there were Ulstermen alive. When he eventually returned to the fortress, all of the men were terrified that his battle rage would kill them all. The king's wife devised a plan to distract him by leading the women of the Emain outside, bare-breasted, and for the most part this distraction worked, as the Ulstermen were able to wrestle him to the ground, throwing barrels of water on him until he cooled down and returned to his normal state. Despite how unpleasant Cuchulainn looked during his warp spasms, when he was a normal young man, he was described as possessing untold beauty, so much so that the other men of Ulster were worried that without his own wife he would attempt to take theirs. So they began to search all of the lands for a suitable wife. The only woman that they found that Cuchulainn showed any interest in was Emer, the youngest daughter of Forgal monarch. Now, as you can expect, Forgal, hearing of Cuchulainn's unpredictable nature, was against the idea, and suggested that before he married his daughter, he travelled to Scotland, in the land of Alba, and trained with the renowned female warrior Skatak, in hopes that the young warrior would be killed. Cuchulainn, not being one to back away from a challenge, accepted, and travelled to Dun Scaith, otherwise known as the Fortress of Shadows, to begin his training. Thorgal in the meantime planned to offer his daughter to Lugaid, one of the kings of Munster, but when the king had heard that Emer was in love with Cuchulainn, he refused to take her hand in marriage. Meanwhile, back in the Fortress of Shadows, Cuchulainn began to learn all of the arts of war, and it wasn't too long before his mentor came up against her fiercest rival in battle, Aoife. Skatak, fearing that the young boy was not ready for a battle of this magnitude, gave him a sleeping potion to keep him away.
That's what he looks
But
like.
because of his immense strength, this only worked for an hour or so, and he would eventually join the battle anyway. The two were very closely matched in battle, but Aoife became distracted when her horse fell off a cliff.
Oh, he's fighting her
with his sword to her throat.
That's very
Cuchulainn chose not to kill her, on one condition, that she bore him a son. So Cuchulainn, returning from Scotland with a child on the way, was expecting to marry Emer, but Thorgal was still refusing to bless their union. So naturally Cuchulainn does what every rage-induced hero would do, and storms Thorgal's fortress, killing 24 of his men, abducting Emer, and stealing all of Thorgal's treasure along the way.
Steal all of it.
It wasn't until around 8 years later that Conla, the son of Cuchulainn, and Aoife would come to Ireland looking for his father. When he refused to identify himself, the hero killed him, mistaking him to be an intruder. The boy's last words to his father were that they could have carried the flag of Ulster to Rome and beyond, leaving Cuchulainn stricken by the realization that he had slain his own son. Perhaps one of the hero's greatest achievements was single-handedly defending Ulster from the army of Connacht at the age of 17. The Queen of Connacht took the men of Ulster by surprise, when our young hero failed to notice her army crossing the border because he was with a woman at the time. With the use of a curse, she managed to disable the men of Ulster. As the only man unaffected, Cuchulainn was the last line of defence, and he managed to stop the army advancing any further by invoking the right of single combat. He proceeded to defeat every single one of the Connacht champions that were thrown his way. One day after slaying one of the Connacht champions, a young woman appeared to him, claiming that she was the daughter of a king, and she offered him her love. When he refused, she reveals herself as the Morrigan and swears revenge upon him. She appeared in several different forms, attacking Cuchulainn, unable to best him, regardless of whatever form she took. With the Morrigan heavily wounded, she appeared to him one last time, as an elderly woman milking a cow. She offered him 3 drinks of milk, and for every one that he took, she was further blessed, eventually healing her wounds entirely. During his closest combat yet, he barely managed to emerge victorious, leaving himself extremely wounded. He would visit the great warrior Lu, who healed his wounds, and also told him that he was in fact his father. When Cuchulainn returned, he saw that his uncle's army had attacked the army of Connacht, and lost. This sent him into his most severe and spectacular riastrad of all time. He charged into the opposing army, killing hundreds and building walls from their corpses. He single-handedly caused the army to retreat. With Cuchulainn cursed to die at a young age, that death would eventually come when 3 children of the men he killed conspired against him. In Ireland there were several taboos, and it was thought if someone was to break one of these taboos, they would become extremely weak, physically and spiritually. One of the biggest taboos was eating dog meat, but refusing one's hospitality was seen as even worse. So when he was approached by an old crone, offering him dog meat, he had no choice but to break one of these taboos and accept the food. This of course left him spiritually weakened, and there were 3 magical spears made. The first would kill his charioteer, the second his horse, and the third would mortally wound him. Knowing that his fate was unavoidable, he tied himself to a stone so he could die standing rather than on his knees. Despite giving everything he had to survive, one of the Morrigan's ravens would eventually land on his shoulder, showing his enemies that he was finally dead.
I don't know why it fucking does that.
So he could die standing rather than on his knees.
Like the actual
Despite
thing
giving
is
everything he had to survive,
what the fuck's
one of the
going on.
Morrigan's ravens would eventually
Not,
land
like,
on his
looking
shoulder,
at that window
showing his
directly.
enemies that he was
It's
finally
capturing,
dead.
which makes no fucking sense.
When one of the men approached attempting to cut off his head, there was a beam of light that surrounded Cuchulainn. This beam of light burned the man's hand, causing him to drop his sword and cut off his own arm. This light continued to radiate around Cuchulainn until his sword arm was cut from his body. The legends of Cuchulainn are still told to this day, the Irish hero of immense strength and power. We essentially have this Jekyll and Hyde figure who was feared by so many despite being so young. I've only told you a handful of his adventures because there were so many, but I'd love to hear what you guys think. Feel free to share any thoughts and ideas with me in the comments below. And as always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained.
That it is. Alright. Verses. There's a verses right there, I see that. Let's move on. Next we got this. Once it loads. Exploring Celtic mythology. Creatures in Celtic mythology. That's from the Exploring series. Let's take a watch of this. Clearly that's a fucking leprechaun, as you know.
Creatures of Celtic mythology. Throughout this series, we've discussed different gods, heroes, villains, and strange tales, but mythology and folklore are often filled with unusual creatures and monsters. These creatures, less than gods but stranger than men, are often some of the most pervasive elements of oral tradition, providing mystery, superstition, and fear to people for generations. While this video will look at some of the most well-known entities from Celtic lore, including the differences from popular depictions, I'll also discuss some of the lesser-known creatures. To start with, we have Aurtach, known as the Irish vampire. According to legend, Aurtach was a warlord who ruled over a small kingdom during the 5th century.
Oh, come the fuck on.
Aurtach was known for his brutality,
it's
and his
just a
people
capture.
known
Look
as
at
the
Aurtach.
Irish vampires.
This guy again.
I'll also discuss some of
This
the
is Dolan.
lesser-known creatures. To start with, we have Aurtach, known as the Irish vampire. According to legend, Aurtach was a warlord who ruled over a small kingdom during the 5th century. Aurtach was known for his brutality, and his people greatly feared him, going so far as to believe that he had powers of dark magic.
Dark magic.
Eventually, Aurtach's people decided to conspire against him, and went to a neighboring clan in the hopes of appealing to their chieftain to slay Aurtach. The chieftain, Cathon, agreed to the task, and later ambushed Aurtach, easily slaying him. Cathon proceeded to bury Aurtach standing up in his grave, as was a tradition for kings and chieftains. Shockingly, the next day, Aurtach awakened from his grave and goes to his subjects, demanding their blood. Cathon returned to slay Aurtach once again, killing and burying him in the same manner, but again Aurtach rose. Bewildered, Cathon went to a druid for assistance, who informed him that since Aurtach was already dead, it was useless to slay him again. Instead, he told Cathon to stab him in the heart with a wooden sword,
Right in the heart.
bury him upside down in a grave, surround the grave with thorns, and place a large stone on top. Cathon went to Aurtach a third time, and did as the druid instructed. It is said that Aurtach is still there, under the ground, waiting for someone to remove the gravestone. Moving from Ireland to Scotland,
Let's
we
move to
have the
Scotland.
Kelpie,
There it is.
a water
horse.
spirit that can take the form of a horse or of a human, generally male. Tales of the Kelpie are spread across Scotland and vary from place to place, but generally it is seen as a malevolent creature that drags humans into a body of water and devours them. The stories are sometimes embellished with the concept of the Kelpie leaving the victim's entrails on the water's edge, and children are often victimized in these tales. Children come across a beautiful black horse, begin to pet it, and climb on its back, and then are taken into the water to be slaughtered, unable to escape. Kelpies taking the form of humans generally seek out the same purpose of killing any who wander near. There are some tales of Kelpies being captured or killed, stating that a Kelpie under control has the strength of 10 horses. Some believe the legendary Loch Ness monster to be an ancient Kelpie.
Dumb.
Still in Scotland, although they are not strangers to Ireland either,
Grimalkin?
are the Ket Shi,
Oh.
spirits taking the form of black cats with a white spot on their chest. Ket Shi are said to be larger than normal cats, and were generally seen as fearsome things to be avoided, particularly in Scotland.
They
One of
can
the
eat
most
your
notable
soul.
aspects of Ket Shi was the belief that they could steal the souls of the dead before the gods could take them. To counter this, people would try to distract the Ket Shi from the body until the time when it would be buried. They would hold wrestling contests to amuse the Ket Shi. Music would be played and riddles would be asked, and catnip was spread around away from the body. Additionally, no fires would be lit near the body, as the Ket Shi would be drawn to the warmth. Ket Shi were also capable of placing curses, and on the night of Samhain, a saucer of milk would be laid out for the Ket Shi, otherwise it would curse that family's cows to run dry of milk. A well-known tale, sometimes connected to the Ketchi, involves a farmer coming home from his fields one night, seeing a procession of cats carrying a small coffin, chanting about the king of cats being dead. When the farmer returns home, he tells his wife of what he had seen, and suddenly the family cat stands up, says, "Old Tom is dead? Then I must be king," and runs off into the night, never to be seen again. One creature present in stories across multiple Celtic regions, as well as elsewhere, is the changeling.
Yes.
Since stories of changelings vary from country to country, the definition can be a little hazy, but most broadly, a changeling is a fairy that has been
Oh, look at this.
never to be seen again.
Again, just because everything's freezing. I'm doing
One creature present in the souls of the
There's a cat. We'll go cat
and
this
catnip.
way.
It's carrying a small.
King Cat is dead. Okay.
One creature present in stories across multiple Celtic
Murder my
regions,
computer.
as well as elsewhere, is the changeling. Since stories of changelings vary from country to country, the definition can be a little hazy, but most broadly, a changeling is a fairy that has been exchanged with a human baby, generally stolen without warning. This replacement could be a tiny adult elf, an elderly fairy hoping to be coddled by humans, a troll or fairy child, or even a magical
my
creation meant to
trolls.
fool the parents until the magic eventually fades. Reasons for taking a human child and replacing it vary, from hoping to raise a human as a servant, as a sacrifice, or simply malice on their part.
Well, they're fairies, so they do.
Some
what they
fairies hoped to have a human upbringing, or they
Sometimes.
required human milk to survive. Sometimes it was believed that changelings would grow up to be hideously disformed and ill-tempered, but it was also believed that changelings could continue to grow and masquerade as humans, sometimes even forgetting that they are changelings. To ward
There's
off
totally not
fairies from
movies made
taking their
about that.
children, parents would often leave iron near the baby, believing
Iron.
fairies to be afraid of it,
They don't like.
or
iron.
leave other simple charms around, or just keep a constant watch over the baby. Unfortunately,
Was that
things
fork in the
also
crib?
took darker
Yes.
turns,
Clearly.
when parents were so convinced that their baby had been replaced that they would attempt to scare the changeling by
off,
abusing
changeling.
or torturing the baby.
Oh no.
This included beating or whipping
Oh,
the child,
No.
and there is at least one reported case of a child being killed when its mother placed it in an oven.
Wow.
Another case in Ireland in 1895 involved a woman named Bridget Cleary, who was burned to death by her husband, who believed she was actually a changeling.
Oof.
Heading back to just
Banshees.
Ireland, we have one of the most well-known Irish creatures,
You totally don't watch a
the
movie about
Banshee.
that.
A banshee was a fairy spirit that was generally depicted as a pale woman, young or old, with long hair, either white or red, and
that.
bloodshot eyes from continually crying. An old funeral tradition from Ireland and parts of Scotland called keening consisted of a woman or group of women that would wail and cry in order to lament for the deceased. Some women were so skilled at keening that they would be renowned as
I'm
professionals
keening.
and would be in high demand for funerals. This is believed to be the origin for the banshee, who would wail and cry in the night, announcing the recent or imminent death of a family member. It is believed by some that each Irish family has their own banshee, and whether or not a banshee is warning of an imminent demise or celebrating a recent death depends on the banshee's relationship with the family.
Ooh.
It was also said that especially hate-filled banshees would continually follow an individual and wail throughout the night until the person killed themselves.
Sounds like fun.
Finally, we have the
Leprechaun.
most famous creature of Irish folklore, and that is the leprechaun. The leprechaun has perhaps been altered more by pop culture than any other Celtic creature, and its early depictions in folklore paint a vastly different picture.
Well, yeah. I mean, have you seen
Leprechauns are
Go to
originally
the
depicted
Hood,
as wearing red
then Back
coats
to the Hood?
rather than green, and their appearance varies based on region, sometimes wearing a cocked hat or carrying a
Sometimes.
sword. An early story involving leprechauns features a king falling asleep on a beach and waking up to see 3 leprechauns dragging him into the sea.
Oh boy, sounds fun.
In turn, he captures the leprechauns, who grant him 3 wishes in exchange for their release. Leprechauns were most well known, however, for being shoemakers and cobblers, and it was said you knew one was near by listening for a small sound of a tiny hammer on nails. Leprechauns have traditionally always been male, and there exist practically no folklore records of female leprechauns, so perhaps leprechauns just spring out of holes in the ground.
Of course. Look at them.
Leprechauns did traditionally have their own hoards of wealth, and it was possible to relieve a leprechaun of his treasure by capturing or tricking him, but leprechauns were notoriously tricky themselves, and loved practical jokes. Leprechauns have certainly become emblematic of Irish culture, despite the alterations made to their design, likely due to their mischievous rather than malicious nature. Of course, there are plenty more creatures across Celtic folklore and tradition than just these. There's the Dullahan, the Irish headless horseman that uses a human spine as a whip, or the Scottish Selkie, capable of changing between a human and a seal. The Welsh have the Adrai Goch, the famous red dragon, and the Cornish have the Spriggans, small fairies capable of changing the weather, stealing children, and casting curses. Many creatures of Celtic mythology have been featured in films, shows, books, comics, and video games, and stories of these entities are certainly among the most unique and evocative in history. While the days of extreme superstition may be largely in the past, we can look back and begin to understand the things people believed when they heard cries in the night, or when they saw something a little out of the ordinary.
Well, that's because of the booze. Many things can be done to find if a child's changeling, but there's a fallible thing. Land, fire, a formula, burn, burn, burn. If the devil burn, but if God and the saints, then stay from harm. Fairy and folk tales, the Irish peasantry. Fairy and folk tales of the Irish peasantry. Excuse me. Jesus. Stop burning children, Ireland. There you go. That's patrons. I think we're done. Alright, next video. Evidence of real leprechauns. The story behind the leprechaun. Are we ready for this? It's like three fucking minutes long by Paranormal Resident. Let's watch. Let's watch.
Welcome to Paranormal Resident. In today's video, we explore the mythical fairy of Irish legend, the leprechaun.
Stock music.
Before we start, could you please like and subscribe? You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all at Paranormal Resident.
And yeah, he's Irish.
So guys, let's get into the legendary leprechaun.
Evidence of a real leprechaun. You're gonna see
Leprechauns are now a symbol of Irish tradition, but where did this feisty fairy come from?
Yeah.
Leprechauns can be traced back to the 8th century. It first appears in stories of a water spirit, which were known as Luc Harpon, which means small body. But researchers argue the term leprechaun comes from the Irish Leat Brogran, which means shoemaker. The leprechaun is described as a very small bearded man who wears a green suit and a hat. Originally, he was known as a shoemaker who wreaks havoc on unexpected humans. The story varies from storyteller to storyteller, but some say his name comes from the Celtic god named Luc, L-U-G-H, which is pronounced L-U-C-K, Luc, which is where the leprechaun gained a reputation for being lucky. The sound of the leprechaun shoe hammer, if followed, can lead you to a pot of gold, but if you're not cunning enough, the mischievous creature will snatch the gold from your hands. As he disappears, you will hear him laugh loudly at you.
Because it's not real
when
gold,
not
it's
making
chocolate.
shoes, the leprechauns are known to like a drink, be merry and dance and sing throughout the night. The leprechaun has only one weakness, and that is that of the 4-leaf clover.
But why?
This being the only way to actually kill the leprechaun and steal his gold. Back in 1989, a small suit and a hat, which can only be described as a leprechaun's outfit, was discovered on Carlingford Mountain in County Louth.
Okay. Leprechaun outfit.
The little suit was found with small bones and a collection of gold coins. Was this finally evidence of the mythical fairy? Skeptics say it was a hoax, but a handful of people say it was evidence of its existence. Kevin McQuilchin, known as Ireland's last leprechaun whisperer, I know, right, was determined to find out the truth. It was a fruitless endeavour. until there was another discovery.
Another discovery.
In 2002, Quilcha came across a similar discovery on Gaughan Road, again in Carlingford, County Louth, yet more gold coins were found. Did he plant these here just to add to his unbelievable story, or did he in fact discover the legend of the leprechaun?
Nice
The problem
doll.
is we will probably never know the truth, but people to this day swear they have seen the little man. What do you think? Is the little shoemaker real, or just the stuff of Irish legend?
That one.
You have been watching Paranormal Resident.
There he
If you
is.
could, please like and subscribe. You
Well, I
can
shared
follow
your
me
video, don't
on
worry.
Instagram at Paranormal Resident. You can follow me on Twitter at Paranormal Resident, and also on Facebook at Paranormal Resident Ireland. You can share this video with your friends and
Oh, I
let me
did,
know
don't
what
worry.
you think down in the comments.
I can.
Until next time, guys. Bye.
That wasn't any real proof of anything. Anyway, let's move on. Next, we've got the Fomorians, the destructive giants of Irish legend. Here we go. Gonna watch these now. This is from Mythologies and Fiction Explained. Some more of this.
There are numerous supernatural beings and races that make an appearance in Irish mythology.
And every
Sometimes
mythology.
members of these races may be described in a similar manner to a god, and other times they may appear as a creature, a monster, or quite often just as a human. We've previously discussed the Tuatha De Danann, one of the very first supernatural races to settle in Ireland, but today it is the sworn enemy of the Tuatha De Danann, the Fomorians, that will be the subject of the video. The Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann are the two predominant supernatural races that appear in Irish mythology, so it makes sense that at some point in time, these two races were locked in a war to decide who ruled over Ireland. Despite the hostility between the two races, they were still known to intermarry and have children, similar to what we see in Norse mythology between the Norse gods and the Jotnar. There is a very clear distinction between the characterization of both races. The Tuatha De Danann are often shown to represent growth and civilization, whereas the Fomorians were gods and creatures associated with darkness, death, and the destructive qualities and powers of nature. This definitely manifests itself in their physical appearance. The Tuatha De Danann are very similar to human in appearance, but the Fomorians on the other hand come in numerous shapes and sizes. They often appear as small to medium-sized creatures, with deformities that sometimes resemble goblins or other mischievous creatures. But if we break down the meaning of their name, perhaps we can understand how they were originally viewed by the Irish. In Old Irish, the word foe was thought to mean below, beneath, or lower. The word more, meaning great or big, derived from an Old Irish term that was thought to describe a demon. This fueled the belief that the Fomorians may have been large beings or creatures that came from beneath the ground or even the sea. I do personally like these interpretations of the Fomorians, as they have quite a Lovecraftian feel to them. Regardless of their size, it was quite common for the Fomorians to be described or depicted as having a variety of deformities, be it missing or additional limbs, a hunched back, or a body covered in large warts and pustules. There has been some debate as to who the first settlers of Ireland were, with many believing it to be the Fomorians. If we follow the medieval myth of Partholon, who arrived in Ireland with his people 300 years after Noah's flood, when they eventually settled, the Fomorians were already there. The 17th century historian Geoffrey Keating believed that the Fomorians arrived 200 years earlier, led by Quicho Grienjos, and survived mostly on a diet of fish, which could contribute to their association with the sea. The people of Partholon would eventually go to war with the Fomorians in the Battle of Maith, the first battle of Ireland. According to the Le Borgabala Erin, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, 300 Fomorians took part in this battle, and along with their leader, they were all slain. There are some contrasting details regarding the location of the battle and how many Fomorians were killed. They all seem to agree that the battle was won by Partholon and his people. The people of Partholon would prosper for hundreds of years before they would eventually all die of the plague.
The plague.
Despite losing the battle, the Fomorians were the one constant factor in Irish mythology. Many races invaded Ireland, but the Fomorians were always ever present in the background. When the Tuatha De Danann defeated the Firbolg, their first king in Ireland was Bress, who was half Fomorian, the result of a union between Eerie and a Fomorian prince Elatha. Both Elatha and Bress were described as being extremely beautiful, contrasting from the appearances we described earlier. Bress, however, turned out to be quite a questionable king, forcing the Tuatha De Danann to work as slaves, paying tribute to the Fomorians. He would eventually be dethroned and lose all authority, fleeing to his father, asking for help in restoring his kingship. His father refused to help him, as he thought he was an unworthy king. With no other options, Bress turned to Balor, a fierce Fomorian war chief, with a large eye in the middle of his forehead that, when opened, caused untold destruction. Balor agreed to help Bress, and together they raised an army to challenge the Tuatha Dé Danann for the rule of Ireland. The Tuatha Dé Danann would be led into battle by another half Fomorian, Lugh, whose mother was Balor's daughter. This battle would be referred to as the Second Battle of Mai Turid, the Fomorians being led by Balor and the Tuatha Dé Danann by Lugh. The current king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Nuada, would be slain in the battle when Balor opened his poisonous eye, killing all those that gazed upon him. Lugh would eventually come face to face with his grandfather, and when Balor attempted to open his eye, Lugh drew his sling and fired a rock, driving Balor's eye through the back of his head and destroying the majority of the Fomorian army behind him. After suffering such a devastating blow, the Fomorians were defeated and driven back into the sea. Over time, the meaning of the word Fomorian changed to instead refer to pirates or seaborne raiders.
That's not what it means, though.
The Fomorians are such an interesting race because they can literally appear as anything: gigantic monsters, small agile creatures with unique deformities, or just as a handsome prince. They have quite a close link to the Tuatha Dé Danann, as they descended from the same god, and as we've seen, quite a few noticeable figures in the Tuatha Dé Danann are actually half Fomorian. I'd love to know how you picture the Fomorians. Do you see them as a horde of demonic creatures that came from underground? Perhaps as giants that rose from the sea? Or maybe a mix of both? Let me know in the comments below. As always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained.
There he is. Alright, next video. We got one of these. Beware the Banshee. It's from Snarled. Let's take a watch of this. Come on.
Door slowly swung open.
Remember this channel.
Hey, I'm Sapphire. Want to hear something scary? And now we close this volume with a story from Megan in Scotland. Megan never believed in the paranormal until it begged for her attention. Megan and her boyfriend Mikey had just moved into a flat in Aberdeen, Scotland. It was small, but cozy. There were 2 large windows, one in the kitchen that faced the garden, and one in the bedroom that faced the street. They usually kept the blinds closed to hide their expensive musical equipment. One night, Mikey was attending a concert in Glasgow and wouldn't return home until 4 in the morning, leaving Megan all alone. After he left, she spent the night catching up on her favorite TV shows. She fell asleep with her TV on, but a sound jolted her awake around 11:45 p.m. It was a slow knocking. She got out of her bed, thinking that it was her upstairs neighbor asking to turn her TV down, as it was still blaring when she woke up. She readied her apology in her head and walked to the front door. But when she looked inside the peephole, no one was there. She shrugged it off, thinking she must have been imagining the sound, and walked back to her bedroom. And then she heard it again. It was coming from the kitchen. She must have forgotten to close the blinds that night, because when she turned on the light, she was face to face with a woman in the window.
The Banshee.
She was wearing a dark overcoat, and her long red hair hung around her face like seaweed. Her mouth was twisted up into a terrifying grimace, showing the few rotten teeth she had left.
That's just the Irish.
Megan knew
locals.
what this was.
The Scottish.
Her
locals.
grandparents told her the stories when she was little. That was no woman. That was a banshee. In Irish mythology, a banshee is a female spirit who lives by the river. They usually have the appearance of an old hag,
totally
but are capable of making themselves as young and beautiful as they choose. In Ireland and Scotland, it is traditional for women to wail or keen at funerals. So if you hear the keen of the banshee, she's alerting you that death is nearby. Let me in, the banshee croaked,
Don't do that.
her strained voice echoing in the walls.
I've been hurt.
But Megan didn't believe her. She was now tapping louder on the glass. I'm gonna get you some help.
What kind of fucking woman are you?
Megan ran to her bedroom and dialed the police. She sat on her bed, shaking and praying to every god she could think of. It was the most horrifying
All the
experience
gods
of
need
her
no
life.
help.
The banging on the window had stopped. Is she gone? Megan thought to herself. But then she noticed a shadow from behind her bedroom curtain.
Little bitch.
Little bitch.
You think you're too good?
There was nothing Megan could do but wait there while
Oh,
the
heads
banshee
up, we've
taunted
detected
her.
copyrighted audio. Oh, something in this is copyrighted. Oh no. Can't watch that then. Oh, I'm really broken up about that one. Let me tell you, Chet, I am really broken up about that one. Okay, we'll move on then. That's fine. I don't care. We're gonna hear about the horned god of Celtic mythology next. Churnos, I believe is how you say that. I'm not entirely sure. Come on, let's wait and get this shit moving so I can... Come on. Come on. Just fucking go away. So I can get on with this. Come on. We're almost at the hour mark for the show. Let's go. Let's fucking go. Any day now. Blame Strog. Churnos? I think so. C-E-R-N-U-N-N-O-S. Churnos? I believe that's how you say that? I'm not sure. Come on. We good yet? There we go. Okay. Let's watch this from Mythologies and Fictions Explained. Here we go.
God of the green, Lord of the forest, I offer you my sacrifice. I ask you for your blessing.
It's Ceranos.
You are the man in the trees, the green man of the forest, who brings life to the dawning spring.
Man.
You are the deer in rut, mighty horned one, who roams the autumn forest. The hunter, circling around the oak. The antlers of the wild stag, and the lifeblood that spills upon the earth each season. God of the green, Lord of the forest, I offer you my sacrifice. I ask only for your blessing.
Swamp Thing.
The name Cernunnos was one given
Cernunnos?
to an extremely powerful and ancient
Cernunnos,
deity
that's what
that
he
was
just
widely
said. I
worshipped
have no
throughout
idea
the
if that's how
world,
it's correct
and
or
still
not.
is even to this day. Cernunnos can be translated to mean horned one in Celtic, and the horned god was just one of the many names that the deity went by.
Okay.
His origins can be traced back to nearly every culture throughout time, but the name and appearance changes. Cernunnos, as he's known in Celtic mythology, is perhaps the one we're most familiar with. He often appears as human, or at least human-like, with the antlers of a stag, sometimes even with horns that we'd associate with a satyr or a faun, resembling the Greek god of the wild Pan, and much like the Greek god, Cernunnos was seen to be a god of the wild, nature and fertility, amongst many other things. Being a deity so heavily associated with nature, he was often accompanied by a group of animals that were thought to be symbolic of the god. The stag, the bull, and the ram. He was also often seen holding a horned or spotted snake. Despite appearing as somewhat human, many believe that he wore a human face and did not take a particular interest in the concerns of humans. He was a protector of animals, often being called the Lord of Animals, and it's very likely that few hunted in his woods without appeasing the god first.
Yeah, appease that god.
There are those who saw his connection with animals as also being connected to our own deeply buried instinctual and animalistic natures. The earliest known depictions of Cernunnos were found in northern Italy, within the region of Valcamonica, which was under Celtic occupation from around 400 BC. His worship continued to grow in the region of Gaul, which covered a host of countries in Western Europe, and the images of the horned god can even be found in the French capital of Paris.
Oh boy.
While digging under the Cathedral of Notre Dame, an ancient pillar was found. It was named the Pillar of the Boatman, and it contains 16 carved images from the Greco-Roman pantheon, as well as some Celtic inscriptions. There is a carving of a man with horns, which has led many to believe that it was indeed the horned god Cernunnos. There are those who would argue that the image could have also been a depiction of the Greek god Pan. It's fairly difficult to read because of the tablet's age and the erosion and damage caused over time, but inscribed above the image in Latin is the word Ernuno, which we can assume refers to the Celtic interpretation of the horned god. It's impossible for us to identify every horned god as Cernunnos, but the image on a pillar shows a torque, a piece of jewellery that was common amongst the Celtic people. It was often used to show a person of high status, and in some other cultures torques were thought to have mystical powers, being able to ward off curses and provide the wearer with protection during battle. With Cernunnos being a god that was thought to protect all animals, he can be found wearing a torque around his neck or hanging from his antlers, sometimes even just holding the piece of jewellery in one hand with a snake in the other. One of the most noticeable depictions of the horned god can be found on the Dunderstruck cauldron, where we see him holding a torque and a serpent, surrounded by numerous creatures, a dog, a raven, and a stag, creatures that we often see appear in tales of mythology and folklore. Cernunnos was a god worshipped in both pagan and Wiccan practices. The cycle of the seasons in some Wiccan practices followed the relationship between the horn god and the goddess, with Cernunnos representing male energy. The fall symbolized the death of the horn god, as the land and vegetation became dormant during the autumn and winter. In the spring, however, the horn god was resurrected, where he would impregnate the fertile goddess of the land. This interpretation of the horn god and his relationship or marriage with the mother goddess is a relatively recent pagan and Wiccan concept, and was likely not one celebrated by the Celtic people. The ancient Celtic people would have seen and worshipped Cernunnos in a different manner. They would often attempt to commune with the god, seeking to receive some of his power, dressing themselves in animal skins and adorning skulls to honour the fallen wildlife. There are theories that the Celtic interpretation of the horned god could have evolved into what the pagans believed to be the Green Man, a spirit associated with nature and man's reliance on the cycle of growth that comes with spring. The Green Man sometimes appears as an ordinary man covered in leaves, but sometimes he takes the form of a walking tree, similar to the race of Ents that we see in Tolkien's Middle-earth.
The Green Giant?
Cernunnos at times is a very misunderstood god for several reasons. Naturally because of his horns and the occasional depiction of a large erect phallus, images of Cernunnos can be misinterpreted as a symbol of Satan. With the Christian church not taking kindly to the worship of other deities, they quickly labelled the pagan following of Cernunnos as devil worship, and they did their best to discredit all aspects of the horned god's character, constantly comparing him to Satan as an attempt to make it almost impossible to distinguish between the two. The depictions of Satan at the time included horns that resembled the Celtic deities. We can assume that this was done deliberately, and it certainly created confusion amongst those who had never heard of the Celtic interpretation of the horned god.
They're not the only ones to do it either.
There are some accounts that associate Cernunnos with the underworld, being somewhat of a guide to the dead. He was able to move with amazing stealth and grace, being able to walk through thickets and woods without being seen or heard. It's likely the way that he moved was considered otherworldly, and thus he was thought capable of walking in between the veil that separated the realm of the living from the realm of the dead. He was known to help guide the dead from their previous life to their new one, where he encouraged them to continue the pursuit of wisdom and happiness. Cernunnos being seen as a prosperous god ties in with his association with the Yule season, the 13th of December until the 25th, what many of us will consider Christmas Day. During this period he was referred to as the gifting stag, a mystical creature whose antlers were thought to symbolise the strange powers of the winter solstice season. It was thought that sometimes he would appear on the 26th of December, where he would encourage those who received gifts to give them away to those less fortunate than themselves. There isn't much, if any, Celtic literature surrounding Cernunnos, and this does lead to a lot of confusion around the god. What we do know for sure is that he was a god who went by many different names in many different cultures. Over the years he's been associated with a host of different things. He was the god of the wild, fertility, wealth, life and death, the hunt, and of course animals. Whether you believe Cernunnos was one of the many interpretations of the horned god, or the original, his influence and aspects can be seen in many different cultures. From Herne, the English god of the wild hunt, to Pan, the great god of the wild in Greek mythology, Pashupati, the lord of animals in Hindu mythology, and even Vles, the god of the forest in the Slavic pantheon. Sadly, Cernunnos is a god that we don't know much about, and the majority of that falls onto the Christian church, attempting to erase him from existence. As someone who is quite fond of the Greek god Pan, Cernunnos is also a deity that I'm naturally drawn to. I don't consider myself particularly well versed in Celtic mythology, or pagan and Wiccan practices, so if there's anything I've missed, or you'd like to share your thoughts with me, I look forward to hearing from you in the comments below. As always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained.
Well, thank you. Alright, let's move on. Now I got more Banshee lore. Actually, before that, let's do this instead. I changed my mind, chat. We're gonna go with this. Top 5 terrifying creatures from Celtic folklore from top 5 scary videos. Here, and we know this channel pretty well. Let's fucking go.
Folklore is a curious thing. It goes without saying that over here at Top 5 Scary Videos, we've had a bit of a penchant for exploring all things folklore, be it in both modern literature and horror, as we trace back the same cultural bones that have since been laid in the foundations of all things folk. Although profoundly similar to the folklore of wider Europe, Celtic folklore in particular has some of the most bizarrely unique concepts of the same set of cautionary tales that still find their place in modern horror to this day. So in that case, let's figure out where it came from. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host, Jack Finch. Today we curiously take a look at the top 5 most terrifying creatures from Celtic folklore. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that scene was from 2019's The Hole in the Ground, written and directed by Lee Cronin, that just so happens to feature one of Ireland's most unnerving facets of folklore as its titular horror villain. Also, as a side note, that film was surprisingly great, and although it has flown under the radar since its release, it's certainly worth a look-see if you're hankering for some folklore in horror. So yeah, consider this your most honourable of honourable reminders. Yeah, that works. Anyway, on with the show. Kicking off at number 5. The Questing Beast. And what better place to begin our folkloric journey than with the ultimate adversary of all things monster hunting in the long history of the British Isles, the Questing Beast. And yeah, whilst the name may be a dead giveaway, in folklore there is perhaps no other creature that is quite as bizarre as this one. Otherwise known as the Beaglatistion or the Barking Beast, this particular creature is a key monster in Arthurian legend, and in the forgotten days of King Arthur's Britain, his Knights of the Round Table, most prominently Sir Palomides and Sir Percival, made it their quest to hunt this thing down. As the legend goes, this strange creature had the head and neck of a snake, the body of a leopard, the haunches of a lion, and the cloven feet of a hart. The name, primarily Beaglatistion, comes from the great noise that it emits from its belly, a barking noise that allegedly sounded like 30 couple hounds questing. Bizarrely enough though, the legend of the Questing Beast is allegedly a variant of the mythological medieval view on giraffes. Do with that information as you will, but yeah, that's anyone's guess. Perhaps the most memorable appearance of the Questing Beast in Arthurian legend was in Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, where after he had an affair with his half-sister Morgan, they didn't know they were related at the time, just FYI, the Questing Beast appears to Arthur in a disturbing vision drinking from a clear and still pool. In that same dream, he sees a prophecy that foretells Mordred's destruction of Camelot, and he then intertwines the two. Later on, Merlin reveals to Arthur that the Questing Beast was actually born of a human woman, a princess who lusted after her own brother. Sound familiar? Well, in the legend told by Merlin, eventually the brother was sentenced to death by their own father and was torn to shreds by rabid dogs, the same sound that the Questing Beast made. Essentially, Arthur saw his own near downfall in a dream, and the Questing Beast was the result of that. Yeah, exactly. Star Wars ain't got nothing on this. Swinging in at number 4, the Darug Dua. As William Congreve wrote in his 1697 play, The Morning Bride, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned. The Darug Dua is perhaps Ireland's most tragic and fearsome tale of that fact, one that is still whispered at grave sites and burials to this day. Surprisingly enough, in terms of horror, the Darug Dua is perhaps a lot more recognisable than we may have first imagined. In fact, loosely meaning red blood sucker, this terrifying visage of folklore horror is the closest that Celtic mythology has come to detailing the archetypal vampire. As the legend goes, thousands of years ago, she was a legendary beauty with blood-red lips and pale blonde hair, and her true name has since been lost to the ages, overshadowed by the folklore villain she became. As kind as she was beautiful, the Darug Dua was the envy of every clan in Ireland, and suitors lined up to win her hand in marriage. As fate would have it though, this sweet-natured girl fell in love with a local peasant, an equally handsome man who was kind and well-natured too, but alas, he was penniless. Eventually, the girl's father instead agreed for an old and violently cruel man to marry her, securing a fortune in the process. He kept her locked in a tower and had an affinity for making her bleed. Day after day, he tortured her, locked away in a tower cell, while she waited in vain for the kind peasant boy to somehow come and rescue her. That hope alone kept her alive for many months, but one day, when all hope was gone, she took her own life. As the legend tells it, the Darug Dua is buried in a small churchyard near Strongbow's Tree in the southeast of Ireland. But that wasn't the end of her. In death, she rose from the earth that same night she was buried, driven mad by the half-remembered visions of her own blood welling on her own skin, thirsty for revenge. As they tell it, every night the Darug Dua rises as the red blood drinker, hunting down young men in a blind and natural revenge. She calls to them in a strange, haunting siren song that lingers in their mind as they sleep, where they eventually follow her to a grave and she feasts on them. The Darug Dua is as tragic as it is violent, and it's a cautionary tale that leaves little to be desired. Next up at number 3, the Queer Hunnock. And on the same theme as the Darug Dua, there is perhaps no other female figure of folklore that is more terrifying than the legendary Queer Hornock. And this one, instead of drawing upon the tragic image of the forsaken daughter turned ravenous blood-drinking vampire, this one instead takes the visage of the mother. And not just any archetypal mother. No, oh no, but instead the mother of the devil himself, the fire spitter, the mother of all demons, and one of the greatest adversaries in the whole of Irish mythology. As the legend goes, when the planet was nothing but a swirling mass of vapour, water and rock, Queer Hornock was hatched deep in the molten core of the planet. There for eons upon eons she waited, patiently biding her time before we humans stepped into existence. You see, the fire spitter needed food for her children to feast upon, and guess what? We were that food. And in the early days of humanity, the mother of demons and her children feasted upon us in a frenzy. However, there is one turning point of this legend where something remarkable happened. And believe it or not, but the legend of Queer Hornock is actually inexplicably tied to the patron saint of Ireland himself, Patrick. Well, he went by Patricius back then, but still. Strangely enough, when the legend of St. Patrick is attributed to his removal of all of the snakes from Ireland in some folkloric canons, those very same snakes are instead the fire spitter and her children. As the legend goes, Patrick had traced Queer Hornock's home back to the cave on Station Island, which also allegedly served as a portal to Hell. There they battled for 2 days and 2 nights before the fire spitter retreated through the swamps and poisoned all of the wells on her way. Eventually the pair fought in a great lake where the mother of demons swallowed St. Patrick whole as they both sank into the cold, shadowy darkness of Loch Derg. Thankfully for him though, St. Patrick tore his way out of her belly and she was banished to the dark, miserable depths for eternity. Thank you very much, St. Patrick. Coming in at number 2, the Changeling. Because we can't really talk about Celtic folklore without describing some of the most prolific entities in the mythos of both Celtic and European culture. The Fae, fairies. In Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann and the Ail Shee, the people of the mounds, and a race of mythical and mystical entities that have since established themselves in playing some of the most important roles in Celtic. In Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann and the Ail Shee, the people of the mounds, and a race of mythical and mystical entities that have since established themselves in playing some of the most important roles in Celtic folklore. In Irish and Scottish mythology specifically, the Tuatha De Danann were considered to be the people of the goddess Danu, the mother goddess, and later they eventually evolved into a far more supernatural design. It is said that the fairies of Celtic folklore could bestow great blessings and equally dangerous curses, and perhaps one of the most terrifying examples of that is with the Changeling, a fairy child left behind in place of a stolen human child. Now, although the theme itself has been used to explain away many unexplained afflictions, diseases and disorders of the time, the cultural significance of the Changeling, particularly in horror literature and cinema, has been pretty staggering. You see, it plays on one key parental fear of a child becoming uncanny, a split double of their former self. A Changeling is typically identified by a number of unusual traits. In Irish legend, a fairy child may appear sickly or will cease to grow in size like a normal child would. In many folklore legends, these changelings grow notable physical characteristics. They may grow a beard or grow long in the tooth, literally. Quickly they may display an intelligence that is far beyond their years, as well as develop the power of foresight. They will know things that should be outside of their knowledge, harnessed by the power of the Ail Shee. In some very rare cases, it was the very elderly of a fairy that was replaced as a changeling, so that the old fairy could instead live in comfort, being coddled by its human parents without them ever knowing. In folk legend, protecting oneself from a changeling was of the utmost importance, and simple charms such as an inverted coat or open iron scissors left where the child slept were required to ward them off. Beware the changeling, that's all I can say. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Balor. And truth be told, we can't really have any other creation of folklore as our number 1 spot Balor, the big bad baddie of Celtic mythology, is a figure that features most proficiently in the mythos of Irish and Scottish folklore. Whereas on the one hand we have the mythical Tuatha Dé Danann, on the other we have the Fomorians, a supernatural race of monstrosities who shamble their way from the bowels of the earth to wreak havoc on we humans and engage in an eternal battle with the Fae. In Celtic mythology, this guy is the tyrant leader of them all. He is often described as a giant with one single large eye that wreaks destruction wherever it casts its gaze. Where have we heard that one before? In the mythos, could instead live in by required to. The big bad baddie of Celtic mythology is a figure that features most proficiently in the mythos of Irish and Scottish folklore. Whereas on the one hand we have the mythical Tuatha Dé Danann, on the other we have the Fomorians, a supernatural race of monstrosities who shamble their way from the bowels of the earth to wreak havoc on we humans and engage in an eternal battle with the Fae. In Celtic mythology, this guy is the tyrant leader of them all. He is often described as a giant with one single large eye that wreaks destruction wherever it casts its gaze. Where have we heard that one before? Perhaps derived from the common Celtic word Balaros, meaning the deadly one. Balor is the be-all and end-all of destruction and devastation in the ancient history of the British Isles. Believed to be the personification of blight and drought, it was written in prophecy that Balor would eventually be slain by his own grandson, Lug, who would become the storm god of Celtic mythology and bring an end to the suffering that Balor wrought. From his fortress on Tory Island, in many myths and legends, Balor is described as a giant eye at the top of a tower that when opened carves a path of destruction in its wake. As many legends tell it, once open it could destroy entire armies with a single glance. Although in many other instances Balor is a humanoid figure that walks beside men, as some folklorists described, he had a single eye in his forehead, a venomous fiery eye. There were always 7 coverings over this eye, and one by one Balor removed them. With the first the bracken began to wither, with the second the grass became copper coloured, with the third the woods and the timber began to heat, with the fourth smoke came from the trees, with the fifth everything grew red, with the sixth it sparked, and with the seventh they were all set on fire and the whole countryside was ablaze. You see, whichever way you spin it, Balor was the personification of pretty much all evil in Celtic mythology and folklore, and when it comes to big bad baddies, yeah, they don't get much nastier than this guy. Well, there we have it, folks, our list of the top 5 most terrifying creatures.
Let's go to another Banshee thing from See You in History,
which contains several mythical creatures. For the ancient Celts, the forests and woods were the home of fairies and elves who wandered through trees and streams, taking care of soil fertilization and protecting the animals. But not all beings who inhabited the forest were kind and gentle. People inattentive could find a terrible monster called Banshee. Present mainly in Irish mythology, banshees are evil creatures that come from the fairy family. But unlike their kind relatives, the banshees lived in caves or the darkest corners of the forest.
Look at those effects.
Usually, the banshees avoided contact with human beings, but they didn't forgive those who crossed their domain.
Let's go back. Look at those effects.
Banshees lived in caves or the darkest corners of the forest. Usually, the banshees avoided contact with human beings, but they didn't forgive those who crossed their domains. Usually, the banshees looked like a morbid, menacing, thin, tall, pale woman wearing a ragged dress. But what's more terrifying about the banshees is their extremely loud scream, which can be heard from miles away. It can puncture the eardrums or even a person's skull. Because of their obscure features, banshees are considered messengers of death. If someone saw a banshee or heard her cry, even from a distance, they would end up dying a few days later. Banshees can appear physically and spiritually. Although their origin is uncertain, it is believed that they appear in the world when a young woman is murdered. For this reason, the existence of banshees is always full of pain and suffering. They cry and agonize constantly. As time goes by, their eyes become red as fire.
Also, yes.
Another version about the origin of the banshees states that they were descendants or servants of Morrigan, the goddess of war and destruction in Celtic mythology. Therefore, the banshees appear during battles. When a brave warrior was slaughtered, they released their long, sad bellow. An ancient legend says that in 1437, a banshee appeared before King James I of Scotland, warning him that his death was near. Stories like these were common in ancient Celtic beliefs. Many women with the gift of premonition were called banshees. The importance of the banshees was so great in Celtic culture that the belief arose that they protected the members of Ireland's 5 noble families. They would only shed tears at the death of one nobleman. With the expansion of Christianity in the Middle Ages, belief in the banshees changed. They came to be seen as suffering souls, wandering through cemeteries or ruins of abandoned castles. In modern times, it is believed that the legend of the banshees has a simple and much less macabre origin, since the famous screams in the forest had origin in a kind of owl. The owl is known for emanating a long and acute scream, with chills on
As
dark
owls
nights.
do.
Be it folkloric stories or not, watch out for the night adventures of the forests of Ireland. Otherwise, you may end up hearing the cry
Go
of
in the
death.
forest in Ireland at night. Spoopy. Baby Yoda. I see what you're doing there, Strog. I see it. I see it. I see you. Okay. Last video for tonight, we got Dankula. Here we go.
We're going to be trying out a new type of content. I really enjoy making series about things that I find really interesting, and Mad Lads has been a hell of a success,
Super dry
so
hat.
why not add some others to the pile? And one thing that I've been asked for a hell of a lot was Celtic myths. Things like mythical creatures,
Celtic
legends,
myths.
and fables from Celtic folklore. And it seems like a lot of you really wanted that as well. Now, this isn't going to be like Ancient Aliens where I try and pretend that any of this stuff is real, right? Remember, these are all just fables and legends.
Yes.
But they are very interesting and entertaining, and it's fun learning about ancient Celtic history and legends. And who knows, you might learn a little bit of Gaelic along the way. So,
little bit of Gaelic
to get
along the way.
started, let's look at a type of creature that you should always be on the lookout for whenever you're near any rivers or lochs.
A water horse.
Kelpies.
Spooky. Is this themed in like spooky? That's hilarious. Oh, we make some more of these. There's a Kelpie. There it is, right there. This is loud as fuck. Down a little more. There we go, that's better. Kelpies.
But before we get into the video, it's in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. With
Okay,
millions of
skipping
champion combinations and challenging other players,
Skip.
a great champion as soon as you capture and
Okay, here we go.
available to new players and
This shirt's
only
gonna
for the
change.
next 30 days, and you can find these rewards here in your inbox.
That's a big ass
Kelpies are
tablet.
essentially evil aquatic spectral horses with magical powers that they would use to lure, capture, and kill their victims. Their name means colt, which of course is also the name for a young male horse, adding to the belief that Kelpies are almost exclusively male. The goal of a Kelpie apparently is to find companionship with humans, though this very often does not work out well for the humans, since Kelpies are extremely likely to kill you. They will be nice at first to lure you in, but after that they get a little bit murdery. Kelpies were thought to live in lochs, pools and rivers all over Scotland, and that there are so many Kelpies that every single loch had its own story about them, or sometimes multiple stories. Kelpies are actually the most common water spirit in Celtic folklore, with some accounts saying that every body of water has its own Kelpie. Many of these stories describe the appearance and characteristics of a Kelpie. They would often appear as a black, dark grey or white horse. Their fur was described as being sticky, similar to the texture of a spider's web, and their mane would always look soaking wet even after they hadn't been in the water for hours. And also, their hooves were said to be reversed, compared
He does myth
to
videos
our
now,
normal
yes.
horses. There were all kinds of wives' tales about how to spot a kelpie, and there were also reports of
frozen again.
sightings, which,
It
of
is.
course, we know for a fact are a lot of shite.
A
But
lot of shite.
if you were a simple local farmer, often appeared people that you saw and survived a kelpie. But
You were dumb.
tales about how to
move
of a
back.
spider's web, and their mane would always look soaking wet even after they
heard
hadn't
that
been in the
already, but I know.
water for hours. And also, their hooves were said to be reversed compared to our normal horses. There were all kinds of wives' tales about how to spot a kelpie, and there were also reports of sightings, which, of course, we know for a fact are a lot of shite, but if you were a simple local farmer, you would instantly become a lot more interesting if you told
Oh,
people
yeah.
that you saw and survived a kelpie.
Oh, yeah,
But
of course.
the truth is, if we are going by the lore, if you actually came across a kelpie, your chances of survival were pretty much zero. Kelpies are 10 times as strong as any ordinary horse, and they could also change their size, often stretching their backs to allow for more people to sit on them and ride them.
Because that's
Now,
not creepy.
why would a kelpie want people to ride it? Well, this was how they lured their victims. Horse thievery was very much a thing, and if people saw a horse just roaming free on its own with no one else around and no sign of the owner, well, free horse. And they would jump on its back so they could steal it. In order to be more enticing, a kelpie would show itself at the edge of a loch to a tired traveller, or
Yes.
someone who was a little bit worse for wear as they were coming home from the pub, knowing full well that they wouldn't be able to resist an easy ride.
Yeah.
Kelpies would also lure children who were out playing due to a child's willingness to approach a wild animal and having no awareness of the danger that they were putting themselves in. The kelpie would also make itself approachable by acting calmly and at times affectionate, which tricked people into a false sense of security. But once the victim or victims were sat on the kelpie, or even if they just touched it so that they could pet it or something, they wouldn't be able to let go or get off. The kelpie's fur would actually fuse to them like a sticky spider web, and they would be stuck and unable to escape. The kelpie's
Would drown
calm and friendly attitude would then immediately change to something almost demonic. And then the kelpie would jump into the water,
Yep, you're getting
dragging
drowned.
its victims down into its depths, where it would then drown them.
Yep.
As I mentioned earlier, kelpies had magical powers which were attuned to water. These powers would allow them to do things such as riding on the water's surface or summoning waves and floods to quickly drown their victims. They would apparently do this if a group of people either camped, travelled through, or tried to settle in an area which invaded the kelpie's territory. Another belief at the time was once a kelpie's tail was submerged in water, there would be a rumble of thunder, and if anyone could hear a howling or shrieking sound, then people thought that that was a kelpie unintentionally warning everyone of an incoming storm. Now, obviously, when it comes to mythology, you come across a lot of different accounts and descriptions of the same creature. People had varying experiences and descriptions of what kelpies are, and there is some debate as to whether kelpies were sometimes confused with the much, much more vicious Echushka, or more simply known as the water horse, since they are almost identical. The Echushka sort of is a kelpie, or a type of kelpie, because they have pretty much the exact same characteristics and powers, but the Echushka is a lot more powerful and a lot more evil. Also, during this series we're going to be speaking a little bit of Gaelic, and one of the first rules of Gaelic is, as you can clearly see, whatever way the words look like they're pronounced, that's not how they're pronounced. The Echushka has a lot of stories of its own, and it's also the only type of kelpie where there are stories of it being killed. In one such story, a blacksmith's daughter was killed by an Akushka, and he had to watch her being dragged into the loch because he couldn't save her in time. The next day, the blacksmith went to the loch and saw his daughter's entrails spread across the shore. So, the blacksmith and his son swore revenge on the monster. They took to their forge and made a bunch of large, sharp hooks, and then they camped by the side of the loch and roasted a sheep, hoping that the smell would attract the beast. While the blacksmith and his son were hiding nearby, they also left the hooks in the fire so they would be red hot.
Oh.
And then a mist began to rise from the loch, and the beast appeared and lunged for the sheep. The blacksmith and his son jumped out and rammed the red-hot hooks into the Akushka's body. And then they fought with the creature all night. And by morning, they had killed it. And then its body disintegrated and turned into a jelly-like substance. Another story which is a little harder to pin down is apparently an Akushka was killed by a man after it tried to seduce his sister.
What?
This is another thing that Kelpies do, but more on that later. And some reports say that this happened on the Isle of Lewis, but other reports say that it happened on the mainland, and the location that the creature was slain was then called Knyok Nabesh, or the hillock of the monster, where apparently some standing stones were erected to keep the beast sealed away. The problem is, during our research, we couldn't actually find this location, not on the Isle of Lewis or on the mainland. But this Akushka apparently lived in Loch Avulin, which is a real loch that is on the mainland. So the location of the hillock of the monster should be somewhere in this area, but we haven't been able to find its exact location. Also, it's possible that this story was actually referenced in The Witcher 3 during the quest, The Whispering Hillock, where you allow an ancient spirit to escape the hillock by allowing it to possess a black horse.
No, that's
creepy. Maybe this was a reference to this story, maybe it wasn't, but the similarities with the hillock and an evil demon inside a black horse, it's pretty similar. Now, you're probably wondering what happens after the Kelpie pulls its victims to a watery grave. Well, some say that the Kelpies would then eat their prey and then they would throw up their entrails along the edge of the loch or riverside as a way of marking their territory. But other people believed that if a person was caught and dragged into the water by a Kelpie, they would simply vanish. In a famous story, a group of young boys who were the sons of clan chieftains from the Western Isles set out on a fishing expedition in the Hebrides. And while they were on the fishing trip, the sons had spotted a Kelpie from a distance on the Isle of Muck, which, yes, is a real Scottish island.
Oh, Jesus.
And they described it as being a beautiful creature that was as white as the froth of the waves. And they noted that on their approach, it was gentle and whinnied softly. The Kelpie instantly showed affection towards them, even allowing them to pet it. One of the sons thought that the horse must be lost because no one on this island could possibly be rich enough to own such a magnificent steed. So the sons decided to take it for a ride.
Oh, no.
Each of the chieftain's sons got on the back of the Kelpie and waited patiently for all of them to be seated comfortably. Until one of the group petted the Kelpie on the neck, and he noticed that his hand was stuck.
Oh boy.
And no matter what he did, he
couldn't
remove it. The Kelpie then bolted straight towards the water. One of the sons knew that the only way he could free himself would be to cut off his own fingers. So he did, and once his hand was free, he leapt from the Kelpie and escaped. And as he looked back, he saw that the Kelpie was no longer on land, but was actually galloping on the surface of the sea, heading towards a huge whirlpool. the entrance to the other world.
Oh no.
The last thing that the lone survivor heard was the other chieftain's sons laughing with joy as if they were in some kind of trance before they were pulled into the whirlpool by the Kelpie, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, the other world is something that we're going to talk about a lot if we continue with this series, so I'll give a brief explanation.
Go ahead.
In Celtic mythology, bodies of water were seen as portals to the other world. There are other ways to get into the other world, but right now let's focus on water because it's kind of the main one. And as for what the other world is, well, I'll do my best to try and explain it, but it is ambiguous as fuck. It's sort of like heaven and hell. It's sort of like a part of our realm and a whole other parallel universe. It's a place of great joy and great suffering. It's a place of great beauty and great horror. Mm-hmm. It's the afterlife and it's purgatory. It's part of our reality and it's a whole different reality. It can also be all of the things I just described and also none of the things I just described. And it can also be any of these things all at the same time and also not.
Yeah.
I hope that clears everything up.
I hope that
Thank you
clears
for coming
everything
to
up.
my TED Talk. I did say it was ambiguous. The main thing that we do know for a fact
thank you for coming to my TED Talk
is it's where the gods live. But it's also where monsters live. So it sometimes gets called the realm of gods and horrors. And sometimes monsters cross the veil, so the surface of the water, and come into our world. Which is why in Celtic mythology, a lot of mythical creatures are associated with water, or at least living near water. It's also where some Celtic customs and rituals come from. One ritual being throwing precious possessions into water, so throwing them into the other world as an offering to the gods in order to win their favour. This could be for a good harvest or for them to lend you their strength for an upcoming battle. And such ritual sites have been found all over Britain, and all kinds of artefacts have been found, and one of the most famous being the Battersea Shield, which was retrieved from a riverbed at one of these ritual sites alongside a bunch of other artefacts. I hope that one wasn't for a favour in battle, because I mean, if you were going into battle, you probably should have kept your shield. And there is something related to this that we still do today that is based on this old custom. Wishing fountains. You throw something of value into the water and make a wish, or ask for the god's favour. There are actually quite a few Celtic rituals that we still do today without realising it. Some of them we don't talk about. But yeah, we were talking about Kelpies. The worst and most dangerous power of a Kelpie was their ability to transform into a human. Most of the time, they would turn into an adult male. But there were still ways to tell if the person you were talking to was a Kelpie. Like if they smelled like a river or a loch, or if they had water weeds in their hair, or sand on them anywhere. There were also other tales that said a Kelpie's human form would still have hooves for feet, even after they had transformed. But these tales might have been due to Christianity and how people characterised the devil and demons at the time as men with hooves for feet. One of the ways the Kelpie would lure people in is by taking on the look of an old wise man in need, or a fisherman who would find a way to bring someone close to the edge of the water. And as soon as they came close enough, it would be too late. The man would pull them into the water with his great strength and drown them. Kelpies were also known to lure women by appearing as a handsome man that would bond with the woman by putting her under a love spell. The Kelpie would then shed a single tear and would ask the woman to wipe it away for him. But once she touched him, that was it.
Dead.
She was stuck and would get dragged into the water. Not all Kelpies would take the time to be subtle. Some of them were far too desperate to take their victims than to wait for them to be lured in by some trickery. Some of them would just take the form of a huge muscular man that would attack and drag people kicking and screaming into the water. And of course, the easiest bait of all, the Kelpie would transform into a beautiful naked woman who was bathing in the water. And she would give nearby travellers the fuck me eyes and invite them to join her. At which point she would then immediately drown and kill them.
Oh boy.
So sometimes the Kelpies hunted simps.
That's an anime character. Horse.
Clever girl. There was, however, a problem for the Kelpie, as it could only remain in human form while the sun was down. It was thought that anyone who witnessed the actual transformation would instantly be freed of the Kelpie's trance spell. Kelpies would become more desperate and impatient to find a kill as it got closer to sunrise because they were running out of time, or they would just go back into the loch before the sun rose. It is extremely rare to find a story where a Kelpie is seen in a neutral light, and for obvious reason, they are mostly portrayed as purely evil. But in one story from the island of Barra, a lonely Kelpie was more interested in actually finding companionship than finding a victim.
Wow.
It shapeshifted into a good-looking man, as Kelpies do, in order to draw the attention of a local woman that he wanted to marry.
Oh,
the
no.
woman, however, knew the signs to look out for, and while they were both talking, she realised that she was talking to a Kelpie. Then later, when she found the man sleeping, she removed his necklace, which was really his transformed bridle. And once it was removed, he shifted back into his horse form. She then took the Kelpie to her father, who forced the Kelpie to work on his farm for over a year. I mean, after all, he had just obtained a horse that was 10 times stronger than any regular horse.
Yeah.
Of course he's going to make the most of it. Yeah. Later, the woman took the Kelpie to see a wise man, where the woman was told to give the Kelpie his necklace back so that he could return to his human form. When the Kelpie turned back into a man, the wise man asked him if he would rather continue to live as a Kelpie or become a mortal man. And the Kelpie responded by asking the woman that had enslaved him to marry him. She agreed to the marriage, and they lived happily
what
ever
the
after.
Fuck?
It's a little bit simpy, you know, to cuck yourself to the woman that kept you as a slave for a year, but, you know, at least we got a Kelpie story that didn't end in a grisly death. Now, considering how rare it was for anyone to actually escape a Kelpie, they apparently did have a couple of weaknesses. As mentioned in the story you just heard, if someone was to remove the bridle of a Kelpie, it was thought that whoever took the bridle would have complete control over the Kelpie. Though, in other stories, the control they had would only last for a single day. And the person that took the bridle would die if they didn't return it. Another theory and long-standing trope of dealing with mythological creatures is to use a silver bullet. Some said that this would turn the Kelpie into a harmless, fleshy mass, but Kelpie stories go back way, way, way before the discovery of firearms, so I'm calling complete bullshit on that one. Also, apparently the use of crosses and prayer against the Kelpie could make it back off. But I'm also going to put that one down to Christianity arriving in Britain and trying to supplant Celtic paganism. The origin of the Kelpie is believed to be rooted in human sacrifices to the gods, as people and animals were usually sacrificed into bodies of water. Though, with the eventual decline and lost practices of Celtic paganism, this myth was eventually used, as very many other myths have been, to scare children. In this case, to stop them from playing near rivers and lochs so they don't drown. Another way this myth was used was to deter thieves from stealing your horses. If the thieves thought that it might be a kelpie, then they might be a little less inclined to go anywhere near it. Especially since kelpies were described as looking like top-tier horses, which would have been worth a large amount of money.
Oh, yeah.
Another way this myth was used was due to jealousy, because it may have been used by husbands to scare their wives away from talking to attractive men, because, careful, he might be a kelpie. Kelpies were also mentioned by the famed Scottish poet Rabbie Burns in a section of his poem called Address to the Devil, and it reads as follows. When thou's dissolve the snowy herd, and float the jingling icy bird, then water kelpies haunt the ford by your direction, and nighted travellers are allured to their destruction. This is related in name only, but just outside of Falkirk there are two sculptures named the Kelpies, which were unveiled in April of 2014, and were an excellent use of my tax money. However, these are more of a monument to Scotland's horse-powered industrial heritage instead of being a monument to actual Kelpies. So I'm just testing the waters with this new type of content, if you will. Excuse the pun. If Celtic Myths ends up becoming quite popular, then I will add it as a series to the channel. But I'm just going to let you know, before we begin, that if we do this as a series, I'm not doing it Ancient Alien style, right?
No.
We aren't going to be pulling any of that. So, did a magic horse fuck my wife? Right? We're not doing any of that, right? It's not going to happen that way. These are fables, legends, and stories.
Duh.
And that is all they are.
There are people that are really stupid.
They are interesting and educational, and I hope all of you enjoy them. So, if you want to see more of these and you would like to see Celtic Myths being added to the channel, then leave
100%.
a like, leave a comment,
I shared
leave your
it
mum's
for you.
phone number,
Your
and
mum's
if
phone
the feedback
number.
is good, we'll launch this as a series.
It's great, Dankula. You should continue.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody
Alright. Holy fuck. My eardrum's out. Oh, hi, Porky. Came just at the end. Alright, that's gonna be it for us tonight, folks. Hope we enjoyed watching Dankula. Hope we enjoyed tonight's stream. I'm just gonna do a little shilling, and we will be done. Don't forget the movie caption contest, movie Pictionary, movie Hangman are going in the Discord, so be sure to play those. Don't forget that Porky will be doing a show tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so be sure to tune in for that. And don't forget, most of all, that this Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Esau's channel, Return Seats Open. So be sure to tune in for that one. It's going to be fun, where he's going to get totally yelled at for being stupid. Alright, with that all being said, have a good night, everybody. Peace.